For years, Eustace Conway built a life that seemed untouched by the modern world, raw, disciplined, and deeply rooted in nature. His farm stood as proof that a different way of living was still possible, but behind the quiet routines and handcrafted ideals, something began to draw attention. Questions surfaced, lines were crossed, and what was eventually uncovered on that land didn't quite match the image people had come to admire. So what was found? Join us as we take a closer look. The dark turn of Turtle Island, the mystery surrounding Eustace Conway. Eustace Conway has always come across as someone who didn't just talk about survival, but lived it fully. A man who seemed completely at ease with less, comfortable in a life most people wouldn't even consider. Everything about him pointed to control, to discipline, to a kind of quiet satisfaction that didn't need validation. But lately, his name has been circling for very different reasons, and the attention hasn't been the kind that builds admiration. It began with a tip, not loud, not dramatic at first, just enough to bring investigators onto his land. A sweep followed, careful and deliberate, moving through the same space that had once been seen as a symbol of simplicity. And what they came across, that's where things started to take a different turn. It wasn't what people expected. It didn't quite line up with the image that had been built over the years. So what exactly was found? That's where this story begins to tighten. To understand how it got here, it helps to go back. Conway was born in Columbia, South Carolina, one of 4 children, growing up in a setting that didn't quite hold him for long. At just 17, he made a decision that set the tone for everything that followed. He left home and chose the woods, living in a teepee, stepping into a life that demanded endurance from the very start. While most people his age were still figuring out direction, he had already committed to a path that required everything from him, physically and mentally. That path stretched further than most could imagine. He hiked the entire Appalachian Trail, taking on the kind of journey that tests more than just strength. Then came the horseback ride, a coast-to-coast crossing from the Atlantic to the Pacific that he claimed took 103 days. It sounded like the kind of feat that would cement his place among the most determined survivalists out there. But not everyone saw it that way. Reports from the New York Times and Los Angeles Times, along with details from the book Bud and Me, pointed to an earlier record that told a different story. Decades before Conway's journey, 2 young brothers, Bud and Temple Abernathy, had already crossed North America on horseback in just 62 days. They covered 3,619 miles from New York City to San Francisco back in August 1911, and that record stood firmly in place. It didn't erase Conway's journey, but it added a layer of doubt that stayed in the background. Even with that, his story kept moving forward. His experiences found their way into This American Life, where recordings from his cross-country journey were played in an episode titled Adventures in the Simple Life. Those recordings, captured on a handheld device, gave people a direct line into how he lived, how he thought, and how he pushed through moments most would walk away from. Then came the films. Full Circle, a life story of Eustace Conway, released in 2003 and directed by Jack Bibbo, offered a deeper look into his world, pulling back just enough to let viewers see the man behind the routine. Years later, he appeared again in Reconvergence, a 2012 documentary directed by Edward Tyndall, placing him alongside others whose lives didn't follow the usual path. For many, though, it was television that made him familiar. On Mountain Men, his life played out in real time, raw and unfiltered. Day after day, the focus stayed on the work, the preparation, the constant need to stay ahead of the seasons. It wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. And that was what drew people in. There was something about watching someone live that way, fully committed, that kept audiences coming back. But even that life wasn't without pressure. At one point, his land faced a lien, putting everything he had built at risk. It was a fight to hold on, a reminder that no matter how far someone steps away from the modern world, certain challenges still find their way in. And now, with investigators stepping onto that same land after receiving a tip, everything starts to feel a little more uncertain. The routines, the image, the story that people had followed for years, it all begins to carry a different weight. The question isn't just about what was discovered, but what it means for the man who built his life on that land in the first place. From loincloths to legends, Eustace Conway's brutal path to Turtle Island. Eustace Conway doesn't just talk about living off the land. He leans fully into it in a way that feels almost unreal until you start looking closer. He builds fires by rubbing sticks together, wears the skins of animals he has hunted and eaten, and moves through the wilderness with a kind of certainty that doesn't come from theory, but from years of doing it over and over again. When he hiked the entire Appalachian Trail, He did most of it in a loincloth, surviving almost entirely on what he could hunt and gather along the way. It sounds like something pulled from a story, but this is the life he chose, and he stayed with it. That same determination carried him across the country on horseback, a journey he claims took 103 days, a feat he has held onto as a defining moment in his life. But beyond the numbers and the claims, what keeps pulling people in is how real it all feels. While most people spend their days behind screens, moving through digital spaces, Conway stays grounded in something physical, something immediate, something that demands presence every single day. And that connection didn't begin later in life. It started early. As a child, he was already drawn to the woods behind his suburban home near Gastonia, North Carolina, spending hours out there, learning, observing, and getting comfortable in a space most people would hesitate to enter alone. By the time he turned 10, he pushed it further, walking deep into a nearby forest with nothing in his hands and surviving there for a full week. No backup, no safety net, just instinct and whatever the land offered him. After high school, he didn't slow down. He canoed down the Mississippi River, then made his way across Alaska by kayak, building skill after skill, learning not just how to survive, but how to move with the land rather than against it. At one point, he even lived with primitive indigenous tribes in Guatemala, taking in knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or classrooms. So when he returned to the Blue Ridge in his early 20s to attend Appalachian State University, he didn't step away from that life. He carried it with him. While studying anthropology and English, he lived in a handmade teepee, cooked squirrels over an open fire, and wrote his papers by candlelight. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't an experiment. It was simply how he chose to exist. After graduating with honors, that vision became more concrete. He set his sights on something bigger, something permanent. He found a rugged stretch of land in Appalachia, about 1,000 acres of mountain near Boone, North Carolina, and began the slow process of making it his. Piece by piece, parcel by parcel, he built what would later be known as Turtle Island Preserve. It didn't come easy. To afford the land, he spent years traveling across the country, speaking to crowds, teaching primitive skills, and breaking down ideas people rarely stop to think about. He talked about where food actually comes from, where water flows, where waste ends up, and how clothes are made, pulling back the curtain on the systems people rely on without question. Those tours weren't just about making money, they were part of the same message he had been living out for years. Over time, Turtle Island became more than just land. It became a full expression of that message. For over 2 decades, he has lived there in a self-sufficient way, growing his own vegetables, raising goats and chickens, building everything he needs from what the land provides. He constructed a log cabin using trees from the property, and instead of relying on outside power, he set up an off-grid micro-hydroelectric system using the creek that runs through it. Even the way he moves around stays consistent with that life. He travels mainly by horse, sometimes riding straight into the busy streets of downtown Boone to pick up supplies, standing out in a way that feels almost deliberate. And to keep everything running, he opens the land to others, offering educational camps for young people, adults, and organizations, along with horse-drawn carriage rides through the deep, quiet woods of Turtle Island. His story reached even further when Elizabeth Gilbert wrote The Last American Man in 2002, a best-selling biography that brought him into a wider spotlight. With that attention came even more recognition and even a few offers from Hollywood, though the life he built never really leaned in that direction. Because at the center of it all, beyond the attention, beyond the stories, is the land itself. Turtle Island wasn't just a place he found, it was something he built step by step, decision by decision, until it became the clearest reflection of how he chose to live. And now, with that same land under scrutiny, the story begins to feel a little more complicated than it once did. The cost of loving a legend, why women leave Turtle Island. For all the strength and control Eustace Conway shows in the wilderness, his personal life tells a far more complicated story, one that doesn't settle as easily as the image people first see. Living the way he does demands a level of discipline that goes beyond routine, and over time, that same discipline has made it difficult for anything lasting to take root in his relationships. Dozens of women have come into his life, drawn in by the idea of him at first, the man who stepped away from everything and built something raw and honest with his own hands. From a distance, it feels almost romantic, like stepping into a slower, more meaningful way of living. But that feeling doesn't always last once the reality begins to settle in. Life with Eustace isn't softened or adjusted to make room for comfort. It moves at a pace set by the land itself, and that means long days of physical work, food that's plain and earned, hands that blister and harden, cold that cuts deep into the bones, insects that don't give you space, and a quiet that can feel heavy when it stretches too far. That gap between expectation and reality has ended many of those relationships. What starts with curiosity or admiration often turns into frustration, as his standards remain high and unbending. It's not just about living simply, it's about committing fully, and not everyone who steps into that world is ready for what that really means. One of the few who stayed longer than most was Desiree, a partner who lived with him on Turtle Island for years, sharing the same routines, the same demands, the same long days that didn't leave much room for anything else. For a while, it felt like something steady had finally taken hold, like there was space for both connection and the life he had built. But even that couldn't hold forever. The same pressure that had worn others down slowly crept in, and eventually, they went their separate ways. People who have spent time around him often point to the same thing. Eustace doesn't bend easily. The land comes first, the routine comes first, and everything else has to find its place around that. It creates a life that is consistent, but also one that leaves very little room for compromise. Being close to him doesn't mean stepping into a shared world. It means stepping fully into his. And that same pattern doesn't stay confined to his personal life. The same pattern shows up with the people who come to learn from him. Students arrive at Turtle Island with a kind of excitement that's hard to miss, eager to stand beside someone they see as a modern-day frontiersman, someone who has mastered a way of life they've only read about. For a moment, it feels like they've stepped into something rare. But then the work begins. Hauling manure, splitting firewood, staying on pace with a routine that doesn't slow down. And little by little, that excitement begins to wear thin. Some last a few weeks, some only a few days, and in some cases, just a few hours before they walk away, worn down by what they describe as his strict expectations and a tone that can come across as harsh or dismissive. Still, time has added a different layer to him. These days, there are glimpses of something more measured in how he deals with people. Several interns have stayed longer, committing a year or more of their lives to the experience, seeing it through in a way that wasn't always common before. And then there's Desiree, a partner who remained by his side for years, one of the longest relationships he has had before they eventually went their separate ways. It wasn't a short chapter, and that alone says something about how much he has tried, in his own way, to make space for connection. The work itself hasn't eased up. His approach to the land, to discipline, and to daily life still carries the same intensity it always has. But those close to him speak of a softer edge in how he relates to others now, a willingness to meet people somewhere in between his world and theirs, even if only slightly. And after years of pouring everything into building and maintaining Turtle Island, there's a sense that his focus is widening again. He has talked about wanting a family, and about stepping back into a world he has kept at a distance for so long, not to leave his way of life behind, but to share it more openly, to reach, to preach, and to teach, carrying that same message of simple, natural living beyond the boundaries of his land. Because for all the strength it takes to live the way he does, the harder question has always been whether that same life can hold space for someone else. And that question still lingers, just beneath the surface. The dark side of Eustace Conway's legacy. As much as Eustace Conway has built his reputation on discipline and self-reliance, the years haven't passed without friction, and some of the strongest reactions to his life haven't come from the wilderness, but from people watching closely, questioning what sits beneath the image. In 2024, after Hurricane Helene tore through parts of the United States, Conway found himself at the center of a different kind of attention. He took to social media, speaking with certainty, claiming that the official reports coming out of Western North Carolina weren't telling the full story. According to him, the government and the media were holding back the truth, and he suggested that the real number of deaths was far higher, reaching into the thousands. It was a claim that spread quickly, but just as quickly, local and state officials pushed back, stating clearly that there was no evidence to support it. Even then, Conway didn't step away from what he had said. He stood by it. And that decision left a mark, adding tension to a public image that had once felt more straightforward. That wasn't the first time his name had come up in difficult conversations. During the height of disputes surrounding his land, there were legal issues that brought him into conflict with those closest to him. At one point, he faced charges tied to trespassing, connected to a disagreement over property boundaries with a neighbor. It wasn't just about landlines on a map. It was about ownership, control, and the kind of life he had spent years trying to protect. Then there were the stories coming from inside Turtle Island itself. In 2021, A GQ article pulled back the curtain through the voices of people who had spent time working and living there. Some described an environment that felt far more controlled than they expected. One account pointed to Conway referring to himself as a dictator when it came to how the land was run and how volunteers were managed. For those who arrived expecting freedom and connection, that level of control didn't always sit well. It created a tension between the idea of the place and the reality of how it functioned day to day. Financial strain has also followed him at different points. Back in 2009, there was a mediated settlement tied to a breach of contract involving the property, requiring him to pay over $75,000. That agreement didn't bring immediate closure either, as delays in payment led to further disputes, keeping the situation active longer than expected and adding another layer of pressure to everything he was already managing. And yet, even with all of that, the support around him hasn't disappeared. If anything, it has remained steady. There are still people who stand firmly behind what he represents, who see past the controversies and focus on the core of what he has built. To them, he is still the man who chose a harder path, who committed fully to living off the land, who continues to teach skills that feel increasingly rare in a world moving further away from them. That contrast is what makes his story hold attention. On one side, there's the life he created, grounded, demanding, and deeply connected to nature. On the other, there are the disputes, the criticism, the moments that don't fit neatly into that image. And somewhere in between, the full picture begins to take form, one that raises more questions the longer you look at it. What they discovered on Eustace Conway's farm is concerning. The land had always been part of the story. Quiet, rugged, and removed, it carried the kind of presence that made people believe they were stepping into something untouched. But in October 2012, that same land drew a different kind of attention. And what followed didn't feel like curiosity anymore. It felt official. It felt serious. Eustace Conway had built Turtle Island Preserve into more than just a place to live. It was where he taught, where people came to experience a version of life that didn't depend on modern systems. For years, it ran on his rules, his rhythm, his understanding of what was enough. Then a tip came in, quiet but enough to trigger action, claiming that structures had been built without permits. That was all it took. Watauga County Planning and Inspections Director Joe Furman moved forward with an administrative search warrant, setting the stage for something Conway would later describe as a raid. In September, a full team arrived unannounced: building inspectors, health department officials, a tax assessor, sheriff's deputies. They didn't come to observe. They came to examine everything. Roughly 24 buildings and structures spread across more than 500 acres of mountain land east of Boone were suddenly under scrutiny. And as they moved through Turtle Island, what they were looking for wasn't hard to understand: safety, compliance, proof that what had been built met the standards required by law. But this wasn't a place built on modern standards. It was built on older methods, techniques passed down, and materials taken directly from the land. Rock foundations instead of concrete, structures that followed tradition rather than code. To Conway, it made sense. To the officials, it raised concerns. By the following month, the decision came down. He was ordered to stop. No more hosting visitors, no more interns, not until the proper permits were obtained. Just like that, the flow of people into Turtle Island came to a halt. From the outside, it looked like a safety issue. Inside, it felt like something else entirely. Conway pushed back, firmly. He argued that no one had ever been injured by any of his structures, that the buildings stood strong in their own way, grounded in methods that had lasted for hundreds of years. He questioned why rock foundations, proven over time, were being dismissed in favor of modern concrete. To him, this wasn't about safety. It was about a system that didn't recognize anything outside its own rules. And the deeper he looked into those rules, the more unsettling it became. He searched through the legal language, expecting to find some kind of space, some allowance for historical building techniques, especially for a place meant to educate. But there was nothing. No path, no exception, just a wall. At that point, the fight stopped being just about permits. He began to frame it as something bigger, something that reached beyond the boundaries of his land. In his words, it came down to freedom, to the right to live and build in a way that stayed true to older traditions. He spoke about the idea that it had become illegal to be authentic, that a system designed for modern living had no room for anything outside of it. Support began to gather around him. A petition appeared on change.org calling for an exception that would allow places like Turtle Island to exist without being forced into standards they were never meant to follow. It didn't take long for thousands of signatures to come in, climbing past 9,500 as people added their names, many of them drawn to what Conway represented. One of those supporters, Heidi Parks from Gaston, someone who had known him years earlier, took it further. At her own birthday gathering, she asked guests to sign the petition instead of bringing gifts, turning a small personal moment into part of a much larger push. Behind the scenes, Conway and his team prepared to take their case directly to the North Carolina Building Codes Council. A group from Turtle Island planned to speak, to explain, to try and convince lawmakers that there should be room for places built on historical methods. But even then, there were no guarantees. Officials made it clear that no immediate decision would be made, and Conway understood that it would take more than one appearance to get anyone to reconsider how the system worked. Still, he kept going. He resisted the idea that what he had built needed to be reworked to fit modern expectations, holding on to the belief that he was living out what he called the early American dream, even as the pressure around him tightened. The attention grew, the story spread, and what started as a local inspection turned into something people across the state were watching closely. In the end, the outcome didn't come quietly. In 2013, after the public outcry and continued pressure, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a bill that created an exemption for primitive structures, opening a narrow path for places like Turtle Island to continue operating. But even with that resolution, something had already changed. Because what investigators found on that land wasn't just a question of permits or building materials. It was a clash between two ways of living, one rooted in tradition, the other enforced by modern regulation. And once those two collided, the image people had held onto for years began to feel a little less certain, a little more complicated, and a lot harder to ignore. Are you a fan of Eustace Conway? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video show on your screen. You will enjoy it.